Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 221 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Well, as they say, it's the most wonderful time of the year, the time when people across the world and across cultures are taking the opportunity to give and receive one of human history's greatest treasures, books. This week, I'm continuing the tradition of bringing you some of my favorite books of the year, along with the recommendations of Peter Konieczny, who's both the editor and co-founder of Medievalist.net and a trained librarian. So stick around for 10 of the best books of 2023, along with a few other shoutouts for good measure, all coming up right after this. Welcome, Peter. It is time for the annual list of some of our favorite books of the year. You ready to go?
Woohoo! I am always ready for this.
The most wonderful time of the year?
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. A chance to look back at all the wonderful books that came by my mailbox.
I have to admit, I still have a stack of books I haven't read. So there are some people that maybe would have made this list and didn't make the list because I was just overwhelmed. But I have a list of very good books. I'm excited about it. We each have 5, right?
Yeah, we each have 5. And as you told me, we don't have any books that cross.
It's going to be great. Okay, you go first. What is your first pick? Oh, by the way, mine are in no particular order. Are yours in an order?
They are. I always put mine in order. I'm a librarian. Everything has an order.
I know.
I don't really base it on like, hey, this is my favorite read. But this is what I consider like the most important book to come out this year for medievalists. I'm judging for you all.
Okay, so your list is going to be much more dramatic, and mine is just about feels. These are some of my favorite books. I mean, they are important books, but I don't have them in any ranked order. Okay, so people will have to pay attention to your list and my list slightly differently. Okay.
Yes, indeed. So I will start off, and this is my book of the year.
Ooh, you're starting off with number 1.
I'm starting off with number 1. So drum roll.
Okay.
Thank you. Is The Donkey and the Boat by Chris Wickham.
Nice.
It's a big book, over 800 pages, and it's about economic history.
Mm-hmm. It is a beast.
That does sound exciting.
You just said it was number 1, so it's got to be good.
Yeah. Before I start into the book, I'll go back to when I started as like an undergrad, learning about the Middle Ages. And the narrative you get said is that around the 9th century, there was no trade, especially in the Mediterranean. Everyone was poor. And then the Italian city-states came by. They became rich by getting silk and spices. That started the Renaissance, and everything was peachy.
I think there are a lot of people living in Italian city-states that wouldn't say everything is peachy, but yes, okay.
The famous historians like Henry Pirenne and Mark Bloch, that's the kind of stuff you get that from. So Chris Wickham is a well-known historian. He's like, I don't agree with that kind of idea. And he's trying to figure out, how does medieval economies work? So what he does is take a look at various places around the Mediterranean, like Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, Byzantium, Iberia, as well as like northern Italy, the Italian city-states. And he's looking to see what's happening between, say, the years 950 to 1180, so 10th to 12th century. And he divides it up into the local trade that's happening. That's the stuff carried by the donkeys. And the more long-distance trade, which is the boats. And which one matters the most? And it's the donkey. Much more important. He has a ton of that. This is an 800-page massive tome full of details of archaeological evidence to back him up. But he's trying to say that it's really the local economies that are driving every one of these regions. Now, there's international trade, but it's not being dominated by silks and spices. Venice did not get rich on pepper alone, right? Mm-hmm. Where there is trade, it's, again, local bulk goods like timber and iron and linen, that kind of stuff that's getting moved around from Egypt to Italy and from Byzantium to Egypt. Egypt is kind of like the starting point of all this. It's the powerhouse economy. And when there's connections, that helps these other ones. But it's largely through their internal economies that they're getting wealthy.
That makes sense to me.
It's the local peasantry that is buying these things. Even if they're getting taxed quite a lot, they still have enough capital to go off and buy a new jug. Mm-hmm. To me, I thought it was a really fascinating look at economics and how it works. I'll wait to see if other historians agree with this and see if it replaces the older theories of medieval economies. And I think it will, and I think that will be your undergraduate introductory course. These things can change, and Chris Wickham really did something here.
Yeah, this is a book that I have on the shelf. It was sent to me and I haven't had a chance to crack it open. And I want to, because I think this is really interesting, especially when you're talking about how local economies and regular people and the stuff that they need every day fuels everything. So I'm looking forward to reading this one. I haven't read it yet, but wow, it's your number one book. So that's a good reason to start it.
I'll have to say it's a tough read. It's very dense. I have an interest in like Mediterranean history. As you can see through this list as goes on, I've been looking at cross-border connections, especially between the Arabic and the European worlds. I found this really right down my lane.
Great. It's always good when you have somebody who does a deep dive into that kind of thing. And it's not surprising to me that you've picked an economic one as your number one. That's very you. All right. I'm going to start with my first one. And again, these are in no particular order, but the things I like about books that make me recommend them are the way that the people have looked at the material and the actual content. So I really like the way all the people on the list looked at the material and their arguments, how they get through things, and then also the subject itself. So the first one that I have, and pretty much almost all of these have been a podcast. One, I hope, will be a podcast in the future. But the first one is Temptation Transformed, the story of how the forbidden fruit became an apple with Azzan Yadin-Israel. That was a super cool conversation that we had. It was really fun. So if people are interested in this book after I finish telling you about it, you can go back and listen to that episode. But this is about the story of the Garden of Eden, and how there was a tree in it, the tree of knowledge, and Adam and Eve ate from it thanks to the efforts of Satan. And it was just called a fruit when the Bible was being put together. And so if you look at art in different places, you can see that sometimes it's a fig, sometimes it's grapes, but then it becomes an apple. And then the apple narrative just takes over everything, so that now you just have a picture of an apple and people associate it with the forbidden fruit. And in the Bible, it's not actually an apple. So how did this happen? So Azzan, who is just an incredible scholar in that he knows every language that there is. Okay, Azzan, I know you're probably listening and you don't know every language, but it's close. And he's looking at art history, he's looking at literature, he's looking at drama, and he's trying to trace back, how did this happen? The key is in the language that people are using, and how this language was applied to this fruit back at the beginning, and then how it changes over time, and then how this becomes an apple. So much so that, like I said, you can have a symbol of an apple and everyone knows what it's about. So this was just a really interesting study in that it takes a huge amount of work to look at something so fundamental to culture, this story that is at the core of so many things. That much work to go through all of that and to look at it in several different languages. I just think it's a really well done study. And I think the argument makes a lot of sense. And I think it's one that people should read about and learn about, especially because this narrative is just used everywhere. So Temptation Transformed by Azzan Yadin-Israel.
Yeah, it sounds like a great piece of detective research.
Yeah.
He knows where it begins, the story begins, and where the story is ended. And it's fitting everything between. And it sounds like it's a multi-step journey.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed this book.
Sweet.
So what do you have up next, Peter?
I'm going now to Penguin Classics. I always loved the Penguin Classics series, and what they have now is the Cosmography and Geography of Africa. One of the reasons I picked this is I feel like this is a work that, again, an undergraduate course should have at least a little bit of this source there, because it's one of the very few sources we have about medieval Africa. It's a great story of how this book came into being, which is there's this Moroccan diplomat. His name is Al-Wazan. He went from Morocco to the Ottomans for a trip, and on his way back, he gets captured by pirates. This is in 1518. The pirates take him because of his abilities, I think. He gets taken to Rome, to the Pope Leo. And he's kept in prison there for like 2 years. And then at that point, he converts to Christianity. And he becomes this hanger-on at the court of the papacy. He has expertise in languages and knowledge of these other countries. And so he becomes like this advisor and writer for the next few years. Seems to have a good life, I think. And the most popular is this description of Africa that he writes. We know he lives to at least 1527. And then he seems to have went back to North Africa and converted back to Islam for the rest of his life. An interesting figure himself. But what he left us is this description of almost like from town to town, region to region of Northern Africa and Western Africa. And it's, again, one of the very few sources we have. Is really quite detailed, especially for Northwest Africa, Morocco area. He has this material. It's not the most interesting read, again. It's very much, here's a city. This is what they sell. There's some really nice gardens here. People are okay. And there's mountains nearby. But if we're going to learn anything about Africa in the Middle Ages, this is probably one of the starting points. These places exist, and without them, like, we won't know very much about Timbuktu or the Kingdom of Mali, or even like all these small desert towns. And it's the first time it's been translated in 400 years into English. The previous translation is probably out of date.
Probably. Well, you raise a really good point, and that is there is more and more study that's happening in English about the kingdoms in Africa in the Middle Ages, and not just Verena Krebs, who is just amazing and works on Ethiopia. We'll remember her from being on the podcast before, but there is more work being done on Nubia and Mali, as you're saying, and it's really, really cool. And that reminds me that, speaking of places that were understudied, there's so much work on Jewish studies that's coming out right now. Like last year, we were talking about Poisoned Wells by Tafir Barzilai, and he's got a new source book out that came out last year. It's not on my list because I haven't read it yet. I haven't looked at it. That's on me. But there's a lot of books that are coming out about Jewish life, especially in places like Spain. Sarah Ifts-Decker did Catalonia this year. And just so much stuff that's happening that is outside of that England, France, Christian narrative that was so dominant for so long. And so I love that you're bringing up a source that is a primary source that's talking about Africa, because I love that there is more expansion beyond those old boundaries that used to contain the Middle Ages, at least in medieval studies. So that's great.
Another reason I chose it is the late Natalie Zeman Davis is the one that introduced me to this through her book Trickster Travels. Why is he a trickster, right? And there's this really fascinating little passage that he puts in just almost randomly, where he says, we could be like the bird by the sea that's living around, but when the king comes to collect taxes from the bird, it dives into the ocean and lives as a fish. And it'll stay that way for a couple of years. And then when the king of the fishes, king of the sea, comes to collect taxes, it goes back out into the air. I'll be what I want to be, what's necessary. He kind of sees it as that's what he becomes. I'm in Rome, I got to do as Romans do.
I think she mentioned that in our discussion for the podcast, but it was many years ago. I don't remember all the details. But yeah, she did really great work on this source before the Penguin Classics edition came out.
Yeah, I would say, like, if you can get both, Trickster Travels by Natalie Zeman Davis, it helps you get a more nuanced view of what's this guy writing about.
All right, we got to move on. We got lots of books. We've only done a couple. Okay, so my next pick is Balthazar, a Black African king in medieval and Renaissance art. So this is topical in that it is the holiday season. And Balthazar, if people haven't listened to that episode, is one of the three wise men. So again, this is a biblical story. He didn't have a name. He didn't have a nationality or a race in the Bible. He was just one of the three wise men. And this is one of these stories that came up out of the Middle Ages and really took on a life of its own. There are other ones like that. Stories of Mary Magdalene, for example, just really grew in the Middle Ages and became huge stories. And Balthazar is one of them. So this is a book that is edited by Kristen Collins and Bryan C. Keene. So it was Bryan who was on the podcast talking about this, and it came from Getty. So it was attached to an exhibit that was also about Balthazar. So this is an absolutely beautiful book because it comes from the Getty Museum. So the pictures in it are absolutely gorgeous. And what I really like about this book is not just the pictures, but everything about it is really put together in a way that is, I think, pretty respectful in that it's got essays by lots of scholars of color that are looking at this through different lenses and different angles. And anytime you have intersectionality like that, where you have people coming from different disciplines or looking at something with different lenses, especially a story like this, that again is so fundamental, that if people are walking around the mall right now and they're looking at nativity scenes, they're going to see Balthazar. It's so central now. So I think when you're looking at a story like this, that is so big and complex and long lasting, it's really great to look at it through different lenses. And I think that all of the collected authors in here have done a really good job with that. So Balthazar is a really interesting story all on his own, like how he became from a nameless, faceless person to the person that we see right now in nativity scenes, a Black African king, and what this has meant in the Middle Ages before and since. I just think it's a really great look at an interesting story and a little figure that's always in the back of the nativity scene that no one ever talks about. So Balthazar is a really good book I think people should check out.
Indeed. I remember it's an easy read because the sections are fairly small. Yeah, I thought that was a very good book. Again, it's so beautiful, the imagery.
Yeah, Bryan was talking about the care that went into the design of it to make sure that it was accessible and inclusive. So the actual design of the book was very carefully put together. And I personally appreciate that when it comes to work. I love seeing us move forward and being more inclusive. And it's aimed at a general readership. So if you know nothing about the Middle Ages, you know nothing about the Bible, you know nothing about Balthazar, you're fine. You can just start and you can just read and you can learn. And that's a great book to me.
And it even goes into even the modern world. Yeah, you can trace that even beyond the Middle Ages to the present.
Yeah, Balthazar is a good book. Okay, Peter, what have you got next?
This would be my favorite book of the five I mentioned. It is called The Emperor and the Elephant by Sam Otwell Soulsby. This is what like my area is like medieval diplomacy. There's this famous story of how Charlemagne gets an elephant. I think his name is Abu Abbas, around like the year 801. It shows up. It lives in the Carolingian court for like 7-8 years. People have been wondering, like, hey, how did this come about? There was odd stories that maybe it wasn't in an elephant. Maybe the Charlemagne got tricked. Or this elephant was misdelivered. It was supposed to go to the Byzantine Empire.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
Yeah. So when like historians finally actually started getting around to like, hey, this probably is a thing that happened. They're trying to figure out, why is the Caliph in Baghdad sending the Carolingian emperor an elephant? There was an old idea and a long-lasting idea that there's this Abbasid Carolingian alliance against the Byzantines and the Umayyads of Spain. These are enemies. The Carolingians don't like the Byzantines, and they don't like the Umayyads. And the Abbasids don't like the Byzantines and Umayyads. There have to be an alliance, and they're trying to figure out, how is this happening? But Sam destroys that idea, which I always like. Here's another medieval 101 class idea that comes into my head that has to be reevaluated. And he's trying to talk about the idea of prestige diplomacy. The Abbasids are sending to the Carolingians this elephant, and he's also sent other gifts like a mechanical clock, because they want to show off how good we are. How good is the Caliph? He can tell his subjects, I'm a great, like I can send it off to this way off place. And meanwhile, Charlemagne and his descendants, they can say, look how great we are. We're getting this great gift from a far out kingdom. No wonder we're so great.
The gift that keeps on giving.
It dawned on me like a few years ago, I was reading other text that people would come to these courts in Europe, medieval courts, and they would want to see interesting things and animals like that. I remember how the Mamluks would send giraffes all over the place, and they called it giraffe diplomacy. And that's very much part of it. And this is another example. It's so costly and time consuming. Most of the diplomats that get sent from one place to the other die over their years of voyage. And there's so many expenses, but it's worth it for both these crowns to show off and be able to show off back to their own people about their worth by using these gifts and using these diplomatic connections. I liked his writing style, and I thought it was just a really good read, and it helps us get a better understanding of how medieval states worked.
That is a massive status symbol right there. No one can miss it. That's cool. I haven't read this book. I actually haven't read any of the books on your list so far. I told you I'm behind on my reading, but it sounds like a good book that, as you say, talks about diplomacy and the very physical, practical ways in which people conducted diplomacy back in the day. It's not shooting someone an email, it's sending them an elephant.
I think it helps give us a more complex understanding of how diplomacy worked, how medieval people and rulers ruled. The previous one is, we're going to ally because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's not as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
I like these books that offer more complex ideas. So that's why it kind of fits in with the first one as well.
Yeah. It's making me wonder, what are the status symbols? What are the elephants that people are sending from one to another these days? I'm going to have to think about this because it is a fascinating example. What's going on now?
There's still panda diplomacy, right? So
That's true. That's true. I hadn't thought of that. All right, moving on. My next pick is a primary source from the Middle Ages. You had primary source. Now I've got a primary source, and it is Vox Clamantis by John Gower. And it is the new translation that I was talking with Eve Salisbury and Georgiana Donovan about months back, talking about John Gower. And it is a translation by Robert J. Meindl and Mark T. Riley. And one of the best things about this is that it's free. You can still access it for free. So anybody can read it, which I think is valuable for anyone. Because, I mean, not that I'm rich now, but there were so many times where I would go to the library just to get a 25-cent Penguin classic that I could read and read at home. So yeah, anything that's free, I think, is valuable. And then having a new, fresh translation of an important 14th century text, I think, is also really important. So for the people who didn't hear that episode, Vox Clamantis is the voice crying in the wilderness, which is another biblical allusion, not a surprise from the Middle Ages, but it is mostly a discussion of the peasants' revolt by somebody who was living around there at that time. So it is a dream narrative, like so many medieval poems are, which gives you that nice distance. It gives you plausible deniability if you say something that people will object to. And it's not super flattering when it talks about the peasants, but it's also a very interesting text in that you get to see the discussion of the peasants and what this looked like to be there. And some people have talked about this as being kind of a dry poem, and it's very long, and it is poetry, and we don't usually read that in school that much anymore. Like, people are usually phasing this kind of stuff out, but it is beautiful and it's very emotional. And I think we talk about the peasants' revolt and even some of the things that happen during or afterwards. It can sometimes be hard to access the emotion of that moment because these are facts. We're looking at it factually. So to look at something by somebody who was around at the time, I think, is very valuable. So he's talking about the peasants' revolt for the most part. He also talks a little bit about Richard II, not in super flattering ways either. And I think anytime you can access something that is a primary source, that is freshly translated, that's free, and that can give you an emotional human look into something that we read about so often, I think it's really valuable. So for people who haven't read John Gower, and I hadn't before this year, shamefully, Eve told me I needed to many years ago. I finally got around to it. So Vox Clamantis, I think, is really worthwhile for people who are interested in medieval poetry in general, interested in the Peasants' Revolt, interested in the 14th century. It's just a really good work, and I enjoyed this translation.
Is it a poem? Is it a work that helps you get inside John Gower's head?
Well, kind of, and kind of not. In that, I think that when you're writing something, and you're a poet and you're writing like a dream narrative, you do have that distance, right? So that you can say, this is not me, or I was a dreamer, or whatever. But at the same time, I think that there's always going to be some of this emotion being real, being yours. And then it's the job of readers to tease out what is real and what's not real. And of course, that's something that can be debated and has been debated for hundreds of years.
He says a bit dry, but is it a readable text? Like, I can pick it up and you get what he's saying.
Oh, totally. Totally. That's why I'm saying it's a new and fresh translation. So it's not one that was done in like 1852 or something. It is very accessible. What have you got up next, Peter?
This is one of my toughest to read. It's called Inked: Tattooed Soldiers and the Song Empire's Penal Military Complex by Alad Al-Yagan. First of all, I have a military historian background, and usually when you look at military history, it's from the top down. You look at how the state does things, how the commanders and generals work, and you don't really get to the soldiers as much, especially in the medieval works. But this is artwork that goes from the soldiers up. I said like it's a tough read. It really details how the Song dynasty, and this is from like 10th to 13th century in China, really creates this underclass of military people, people that have to serve in the army. These armies are hundreds of thousands of people. Like at one point, there's 1.4 million people in the army. But they're all made up of the very poor, non-Han Chinese convicts that are forced to become soldiers. And they're treated as like less than the commoners. So you're less than a peasant. The most obvious thing is that they get tattooed. Even military people were using tattoos before this. This has become like tattoos where it's industrialized. You get tattooed on the face with your battalion name and your battalion number. But if you get moved to a different unit, that gets tattooed on you too. And then you get convicted of something, you get tattooed with your crime on your face. These people, they lose a lot of their humanity. It's a very sad tale of how these soldiers get used for like 20, 30 years. And then once they're too old, they become veterans, which means you get kicked out of the military. And then you either become a beggar or a menial worker. Like capital of the Southern Song dynasty is Hangzhou, has 1 million people living there. And he says a quarter of that population are beggars, most of which are veterans. So like I came into this, I had a lot of kind of respect for this Song dynasty. This is like a high point in Chinese civilization. It's the era where it's urban, it's cultured, there's technologies like gunpowder being invented, there's great writings from this time. You've this scholarly elite. But then you realize that they have this disdain for this military, the people that are fighting for them. And they treat them like dirt and treat them as nothing, that they can mark up their faces. It was a tough read, but it was a very fascinating, eye-opening one for me.
So who would you recommend this for?
Military historians probably should have this as an understanding of what it was like to be a soldier, because, we tend to glorify that. But I think it also is something good to counteract the stories that are from like the top, talking about the state or how good a country is. We should do more to talk about the perspectives of lower class, of people that aren't famous. I don't know if like everyone should read this because it's not a fun read. Like, when I picked it up, like, oh, tattoos must be really interesting. No, it's a tough read about people being inhumanely treated. And it's a good reminder it's not something that's gone away. If you want a sobering read, that's my recommendation.
Well, it's worth bringing up the fact, and I don't think that we have talked about it very much on the podcast, that sometimes reading history can be very difficult. You have to take care of yourself when you're doing that. And it's not disrespectful to the people that you're learning about to take a minute and just process it, because some of the stuff that we read about to learn about can be very difficult. So it's worth reading this stuff, but also you got to take care of yourself when you're doing it, right?
Yeah. I did a lot of military history, like especially with medieval warfare editor. And sometimes it starts to get to you. You're talking about sieges and battles, and at times you're like looking at them as numbers on a screen, but there's human lives behind that. And some accounts, you read them and like you realize, man, this is tough stuff. It's not all greatness like we have, like me and you have. Fun every day.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I needed you to clarify. Yes, you and I have a great life, and we are grateful for everything in our lives because it is a great time to be alive and our careers are super fun. So yeah, we have to be grateful for that. But I was just thinking about when I had Michael Livingston and Kelly DeVries on the podcast talking about warfare, and they were saying if you study warfare, you are almost automatically not a fan of it, because if you understand it, then you know that it's a terrible thing, and that to understand it means to understand that humans can be pretty terrible to each other, which brings me actually to my next book, because it is about warfare, but it is not quite as heavy in that it is a little bit more. Well, I haven't read your book, but it is not getting so far into tragic stories, although I am talking about the Crusades. So the book that I'm bringing up is Women in the Crusades by Helen J. Nicholson, because when you are learning about the Crusades, you got to read Helen J. Nicholson. She knows everything about it. So she is the one to write this book on women in the Crusades. And yeah, she's a compassionate woman. And she's also a very intelligent woman who's getting right down deep into what these women are doing in the Crusades and what it means. So she's laying it all out for us in this book why women were involved in the Crusades, what they were doing in the Holy Land, what their roles were back at home. And she tells us some of their stories and how they ended up being entangled in the Crusades. And of course, it is a complicated story. It's messy. Everybody had their own reasons for being there and doing what they were doing. But it's hard to find women anywhere in history. It's hard to find women anywhere in warfare. So you need somebody with the analytical chops like Helen J. Nicholson to walk you through responsibly what these women are doing there and tell you what the facts are. So this is a really good book, I think, for people who are reading about the Crusades. Often you don't find women's stories. So to have it concentrated in one book is very useful. One of the things that I like best about this book, and something I said to Helen when she was on the podcast, was, I was thinking it. I'd have to go back and re-listen to it, but she really traces the familial relationships between people. And that's not only fascinating, but very difficult to do and to make comprehensive to people who are reading it. So those family connections really make a difference when you're talking about like humans making decisions. Like, am I going to go on crusade? Am I going to support it? How am I going to support it? These are the things that people think about and talk about within relationships. So the way she spells out the relationships that are existing across Europe and across the Holy Land and how these are influencing people's decisions about being there and about supporting the Crusades. I think that is one of the most valuable things about the book. And if you read medieval history already, you're going to have all these light bulb moments as you're going, being like, oh, it's that person. Oh, I didn't realize they were related to that person. This all makes so much more sense. So Women in the Crusades by Helen J. Nicholson. It's an excellent book for people who are interested in Crusades and warfare and women's history.
Indeed, indeed. I think a lot of historians will see women's role in the Crusades as beginning and ending with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Helen's been able to do a lot of great archival work. It goes beyond like just what you hear in the chroniclers.
Mm-hmm.
You look at chroniclers like, oh, there was no women, or they're just bad people. Only women are bad women that are on crusade.
Mm-hmm.
As much as it's a military event, it's also a spiritual event. It's a pilgrimage, and women are going to have a full place in that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a great work to have.
Yeah, and she's the right person to take us through it. So yeah, that is my second last pick. We are getting to the end of our list. What have you got for us, Peter?
My last pick is also an open access book. So thanks to De Gruyter Publishing for doing that. And it's called Meteorological Disasters in Medieval Britain, AD 1000 to 1500 by Peter J. Brown. Another thing I've always been fascinated with are these storms and disasters and floods. Yeah, I have a healthy historian's appetite, I guess. But when I come across that, they're often, I read a chronicle and they'll say like a one line, and a storm hit and caused much damage, right? And like, I wish I could know more, right? And this is the book that tells me more. Brown goes through various storms and floods caused by storms that strike Britain. Sometimes they also hit other parts of Northwest Europe as well. And he's able to pick out all the kind of different sources. It's not just chronicles, but he's able to use archaeological evidence, seeing what actually happened to the land and how it changed. Again, I think it'd be great to use for students to give them, here's a case study of this windstorm that happens in 1362. How did it actually happen? Can we trace what kind of storm it was? How did it move? It hit like at 10 a.m. at this part of Britain. And when it hit London, it was already 1 o'clock, all that kind of stuff, and reconstruct how it happened. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And it offers a lot more to this aspect that medieval people had to deal with, just like we do, natural disasters.
Yeah, especially when you're living so close to the land that's giving you everything. Your food, your clothing, all of these things, that weather is going to have huge impact on your day to day. Everything from like, I do not want to go outside. If we don't want to go outside today, we don't necessarily have to. We could have our food delivered if we want to. We don't have to go anywhere. But back in the day, people did. And so it's hard to overestimate the power that weather had over people back in the day. And I think it's fascinating to figure out, or to be able to figure out, what was happening on each particular day. Now, I'm sure it's not an almanac like it tells you every single day what's happening weather-wise, but still, it's great to have a study like this out.
I think you used 6 or 7 different events that happened, mostly 13th and 14th century. But it's also, how do they respond? I thought a really interesting part was just on bridges. How did they have to build bridges? What kind of choices did they have to make? Do we make it out of wood? It can be easily put up and it can be easily taken down too, where bridges may have been changed because of a storm. To me, that was really fascinating.
I love it. You did a post that kind of refers to this book on medievalist.net already, so people can get a taste of it, right?
I've done it as a new medieval book, and I've done a piece on natural disasters, and I've done like one about a windstorm that hits England as well. But certainly, I'm going to actually make use of this book to expand on that kind of stuff. So you might see something new coming very shortly on medievalist.net.
And it's open access, so people can follow the links from the website and read it for themselves.
Yeah, again, it makes a great student read. If you're teaching a course, go into one of these storms, these accounts, and just offer that. They're not very long. Like every section is only 3 or 4 pages, so it's a good little read.
I have a feeling that if you started to teach undergraduates, they'd have to take 600 courses to graduate. You just want them to read everything. All right, my last book, I'm going to admit, it's a bit of a cheat because it is coming out on January 7th. So it is a pre-order, but I read it this year and it really stuck with me. So it was sent to me by Princeton because it's about monks. So of course they sent it to me to see if I would be interested in reading it and telling them what I thought about it. And it is by friend of the podcast, Jamie Kreiner, who worked on pigs before. So if you love that episode on pigs, this is by Jamie Kreiner as well. So this book is called How to Focus, a Monastic Guide for an Age of Distraction. So this is a translation. It's a primary source that Jamie has brought forward, and it's a facing page translation. So if you like looking at your Latin and taking things apart, then it's really good for that. But it is based on, or it's a translation of the work of John Cassian, who was a monk in the 5th century. And he traveled everywhere learning about stuff and trying to be a better monk. So like the Holy Land and Egypt and Constantinople and Gaul, just like all over the place. But what this book is about is the challenges that people have when they're trying to be monks. So if you've read my book and you've read the section on meditation and you've tried meditation and you're like, it's really hard to not be distracted. This book is about that. So it is a really very human look at what it's like to be within our minds and how we just find it hard to concentrate on things we really want to. We have the motivation, we have the training, we've done everything right. Why can I not focus on this thing? And I just think it is so relatable. And Jamie Kreiner's translation is so, again, it's fresh and it's new and it sounds like today that anybody can relate to this. Everybody is distracted. This is why the subtitle of the book is For an Age of Distraction. It's because we are all distracted now. And it's just listening to this discussion of distraction and wanting to be better and wanting to learn more and just trying to make yourself a better person. I think it is so relatable for everybody. And especially for me, as somebody who's explored this, thinking about how to live better and to live like a monk. I think that it's so relatable and so human. And I just really adored this book. So even though it's a bit of a cheat, it is not quite out yet. I did read this in 2023 and it stuck with me. So I'm hoping to invite Jamie back so we can talk about this book later. But this book, How to Focus, a Monastic Guide for an Age of Distraction, was just really lovely and one of those books that hit me at the right time. And I hope that it will for other people too.
It certainly sounds like it has a timeless quality. When you started talking about it and you say it's like a translation, like, oh my, his words from the 6th century or the 5th century still resonates with you. And I think it probably sounds like it's going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, just those thoughts of frustration and hope and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps when you're trying to achieve something. It's really relatable. And I love primary source translations for this very reason. And this is a good one. And it's a source I hadn't read before. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. So that is my last pick. They were in no particular order, but all books that I really loved. And this is the only one that hasn't had a podcast episode yet, but I may be able to fix that in the future.
Looking forward to it.
There is one book that didn't end up on our lists, Peter. It's a very important book that came out this year. In fact, only last month.
well, I have a rule. You can't put any books on the list of like the people that are part of medievalist.net or write for us, or I'm a good friend of. But
yes, Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World.
Yes, your book is an absolute delight.
Thank you.
It would definitely be on my list if I didn't know you.
I think that's a compliment. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, that book came out this year as well. And it would be remiss of me not to mention it. So if you are interested in anything to do with table manners or how to run a household, how to run a kingdom, how to land your perfect date, and how to be a knight, then this is a fun book just for you.
And I know how hard the work you put into this writing. Or doing like one book a year, and you put a lot of effort, like, a lot of thought, a lot of research. So it's a wonderful production.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm averaging one book every 2 years, and they're small. So that tells you what it's like to try and do a podcast, write books, and raise kids all at the same time.
Yeah.
The struggle is real.
And since we're just mentioning like the books connected with medievalist.net, I'll put a shout out to others. They write for us, or also other podcasters. Michael Livingston has just come out with his book on the Battle of Agincourt. Steve Tibble is Templars in Britain. He's done a lot of great work for us here at medievalist.net. Anthony Cadellis, host of Byzantium and Friends. His book is The New Rome Empire, A History of Byzantium. It's like his monumental work. His last 3 or 4 years, all his efforts have been put into that, creating this great book. And finally, I want to shout out Elizabeth Smith Rosser. She does Chinese history for us, and she has her first book, The Misadventures of Master Mugworth. It's a joke book from medieval China.
Nice.
I'm hoping to get that in the next couple of weeks. It just was released by Oxford University Press. So congratulations, Elizabeth, on her first of, I hope, many books.
Oh, that's nice. I love it. It's a new book. It's a freshly launched authorial career. So awesome. All of the books that I've had people on for the podcast are always going to be good. I don't talk about fiction, but I should mention that my friend Dan Jones has his second book in the trilogy, Essex Dogs, coming out. It's just come out. It's coming out in North America soon, Wills of Winter. But you can't just single out everybody, because then you wouldn't have any special books. So all of these books are excellent. And RIP your holiday shopping list, because there are so many great books coming out in medieval studies, and it's just exciting. It's an exciting time to be alive.
Both of us get quite a lot of books now that we're famous.
Yes.
And I'm just blown away about how good the research is, how people are coming just into the field, and they're coming in and they're producing just wonderful stuff that changes our view of the medieval past.
Mm-hmm. The scholarship is excellent, and it's becoming a lot more public facing, which is something that I get behind 100%, because I think that this public, this moment, is especially interested in reading as much scholarly evidence as they can, and to make it readable it's not always easy, but it is definitely worth it. And I love that that's the direction that a lot of these books are heading in. So that is awesome. Okay, so those are a lot of books from you and from me, and I hope that people will have lots to read and have a holiday during which they can read them in the coming weeks. Okay, Peter, what's going on the website?
This week, I reworked an older post called How Did People Sleep in the Middle Ages? And this is the theory of the two sleeps. And what I did was updated and also put in some of the views that are going against this idea. They gave a little bit more balanced view, but that went out and it's doing very well on the website. So I'm pleased that people are enjoying it and liking it and even commenting back. We have another castle for sale, another French castle. So if you have 30 million euros, you can get a 12th century castle. It looks very, very nice, I have to say.
Well, for that many euros, it should be quite nice. I hope there's indoor plumbing.
Oh, yes. It's kind of modernish on the inside. It's a nice 12th, 14th century look on the outside. 16 bedrooms. I'm sure you'll find one that's nice.
Yes. Everyone put it on your list for gifts this holiday season. Castle for sale. All right, Peter. Well, thank you for stopping by and telling us all about some of your favorite books of 2023. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, as always, to everyone who supports this podcast and other indie historians through Medievalist.net's Patreon page. As you know, patrons have access to all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, and ad-free versions of Medievalist.net and this podcast. If you've ever been interested in joining the Book of the Month Club through Patreon, this is your moment, because Abbeville Press is making 2 of my books available for December and January. People who are or become Patreon book club members in December will be getting a copy of Chivalry and Courtesy in the mail, followed by How to Live Like a Monk in January to give you a good start on the new year. To get in on all the delicious book club action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from books to crooks, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, all over social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover and ebook, and soon to be audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.